I was typing, I'm ready. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam, and welcome everybody to our book event, Medina by the Bay, a virtual conversation with our wonderful author, Maryam Kashani, Dr. Maryam Kashani, and an esteemed panel of BBO friends and family, Believers Bailout friends and family. We are so excited and grateful for this gift of a book and this gift of community that we're going to be talking about. I hope everybody has their copy. I know I sure do. I'm going to do introductions, so I won't be up here by myself because that's going to be bad. I'm very, very excited and honored and grateful to be introducing our panel, and I'm going to be your moderator for tonight's event. Starting off, we have no one else but the author herself. Dr. Maryam Kashani is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is also a member of Believers God, not me butchering the name of our own organization. Believers Bailout's national leadership. That's humble. Medina by the Bay, Scenes of Muslim Study and Survival, examines Muslim histories and practices in the Bay Area to get at how and why we mobilize Islam towards abolition, especially in the fate of racial capitalist, carceral, and genocidal logics. Amen. Joining Maryam on this panel is the wonderfully brilliant Kamilah Pickett, who is a racial equity trainer, public health advocate, writer, abolitionist, and cautious optimist. I love that. We'll talk about that. Kamilah's work focuses on the intersections of race and ethnicity, health and justice, and she is particularly passionate about nurturing the physical, mental, social, and spiritual wellness of the Black Muslim communities that have nurtured her and can often be found working behind the scenes with several Muslim-led organizations and efforts. I love that, like, subtle shade. We are also joined by Rasheed Shabazz, who is a journalist, educator, and urban planner based here in the Bay Area. Here, I'm also in the Bay Area. And then we also are joined by Shireen Hamza, who is a historian and artist based in Chicago, working on the history of science and medicine in the medieval Islamic world. And Shireen Hamza will actually be speaking on behalf of Jerel Matthews, who is a member of the Jamaat Ibad al-Rahman. He is a student through the Prison and Neighborhoods Arts Education Project, working on the completion of a non-traditional bachelor's degree in social science with a depth area of community healing and building for social change. He is from the Auburn Gresham community on the southwest side of Chicago and is currently incarcerated at Shawnee Correctional Center. So thank you so much, Jerel Matthews, for joining us, and thank you, Shireen, for bringing his words to us here today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this very exciting, beautiful panel that spans across the country. So salam, welcome. The first question I want to dive into, but first I just want to say this is an incredible book, and thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for giving this as a gift to your communities. Especially because obviously the Bay Area means so much to you. But this isn't just about the Bay. This is so much deeper than that. And it speaks so much to your community back home in Chicago, back home for me in Chicago, now home for you in Chicago, as well as how our communities are engaged both throughout the United States, but really around the world. And I feel like there's such a depth and a richness. And I know this panel is going to be fabulous and wonderful, but is not going to even scratch the surface of all of the gems that are included within the pages. So I highly, highly recommend everybody watching this to grab your own copy wherever books are sold, except on Amazon. And so you can also participate in this beautiful conversation that is ongoing and is not going to start or end with this panel. So I also remember just spending so much time with Maryam June at our co-working space as she was drafting and redrafting. So I know so much work that has went into this. And so I want to ask Maryam some questions, but before we really kind of get into the panel, I'm going to turn it over to Shireen on behalf of Jerel Matthews to give us a quick overview for those of you who, may not have had time to read the book. We'll forgive you this one time, but to give us a quick overview of just the book and kind of like place it within some of the themes that we're going to be talking about.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I will be reading this on behalf of Jerel Yusuf Matthews. Bismillah. Salam, my respected and admired sister Maryam. My name is Jerel Yusuf Matthews. I'm a second-generation Muslim from the Auburn Gresham community on the south side of Chicago. I apologize for my absence. I'm currently being held against my will in Shawnee Prison, near the border of Kentucky. I've been fighting for my physical freedom for 19 years and 9 months, in juridical limbo, a state of continuous manipulations of time, a context of uncertainty. I previously had the honor of meeting you at a Believers Bailout lecture you participated in at Stateville Prison through PNAP, Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. From that day until the present, your articles, your work at BBO, and your transformative publication, Medina by the Bay, has allowed Allah to use you as a vessel to influence me, educate me, and strengthen my will to stay on the Sirat-e Mustaqim, the straight path, in this sanctuary of white supremacy. Here, I am subjected to daily rituals of dehumanization by a syncretic force of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia that aims to exercise dominance, control, and power over. Though I reside in an institution governed by divisive individualism, the Islam I've been exposed to by BBO and Jamaat Ibadur Rahman enables me to maintain taqwa, God consciousness, while promoting group action, communal solidarity, self-determination, and discipline amongst the Ummah as a servant leader. Medina by the Bay gives Muslims and non-believers a much-needed interrogation of Islam and the role that race, politics, and gender play in how Islam is viewed, practiced, and suppressed. You write through the lens of a Muslim woman using both theological Islamic values and abolitionist principles. Quote, an around-the-way approach from an around-the-way girl. You convey the diversity, contradictions, and contentiousness within Islam in a way in which those of us who are in and from the trenches, who are situated in active sites of war, can relate and truly appreciate. I believe abolition is rooted in Islam, so that is the scope through which I view abolition. In Chapter 2, Imam Zaid Shakir solidifies this notion when he traces genealogical lines of Muslims in the present to the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He demonstrates that the first generation of Muslims had different ethnicities, which exemplifies how Islam transformed social relations in a time of tribalism. This was indeed abolition. Muslims, from their inception, have been innovators and agents of change. Imam Zaid Shakir didn't just display abolition in Islam in a historical context, he also provoked thought regarding the future of Islam. He was trying to train his audience to confront manners of difference and discrimination. As Muslims, diversity should be our power, but we are rendered powerless when we allow diversity to build walls between us due to color, geography, capital, and a host of other things that have nothing to do with Islam. We must embrace one another as brothers and sisters in the name of Allah. Together, we are a global majority. Divided, we are reduced to mere domestic minorities.
Thank you so much. Jerel Matthews has actually written a very long essay response to Maryam's piece, so we're going to be continually excerpting pieces from his response and letter throughout the talk today so that he can be as present as possible despite the carcerality of the world. So that was very beautiful, and I think sets Maryam up really nicely to answer the first question that is directed for her, which is, obviously you've put so much time and effort into writing this book, and it's no small project. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about what inspired you. Like, was it a specific moment? Were there themes? Was it something that you've been thinking about for a while? What inspired you to write the book? And then one line specifically that I thought was really beautiful, also on page 27, for those of you following along at home, that Haroon asks Maryam, and suggests that Maryam, as an anthropologist, as somebody who is doing this ethnographic work on the Bay Area community, to not just see herself as this sort of top-down, third-party objective viewer from nowhere, but that you should see your work and relationship not as simply research, but that you should, quote, seek benefit and examine your own relationship to Allah. And so I'd love to know what inspired you to write this book, but then also what has this book taught you, and what has writing this book gifted for you as well? And you are on mute.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Hoda, and everyone for being here, and also just thank you for reading the book and engaging with the book. Yeah, you've seen me working on the book for a long time, and you write the book hoping that people will actually read it. But by the time you're done with it, you're like, I just don't want to deal with this thing anymore. But maybe that happened initially, and then very quickly I felt like the reasons I wrote the book became kind of manifest as people started to react to it. In terms of the initial inspiration for it, in 2006, I was picking up a newspaper and saw an article about what at the time was Zaytuna Institute. And in that article, they write about Imam Zaid Shakir that Jerell mentions, and one of his students says he's like the next Malcolm X. And so this was around 2005, 2006. We were very much in the beginning of a post 9/11 war on terror moment that we are still in. And I was thinking about what people needed to know about Islam and what I needed to know about Islam as a Muslim to actually make a film potentially about Zaytuna College. And so I started to think about that, and then ended up going back to school for a degree in anthropology so that I would have the time and the resources to do the kind of study I wanted to do that would give the topic justice. And the reason that this idea of the next Malcolm X struck me was that I had been really active in different social movements from a teenager onwards. Like, I had started working around issues of police brutality and racism and injustice, like, very early on. And even though I was Muslim, that wasn't necessarily where my politics was oriented from. And it was much more oriented through like hip hop culture and sort of the leftist histories, especially like the Black Panther histories in the Bay Area that I grew up hearing about. And I actually learned about Malcolm through hip hop music, and actually like seeing the film about him by Spike Lee later with my dad, that I started to actually I started to think about his Islam and my Islam in a different way. And so it felt like it was a political moment where we needed something more than sort of what we had come through with previously in terms of the lessons and the histories and the theories, right? All the leftist theories of social change. It felt like we needed something more. And I was really interested in what Imam Zaid and others were talking about in terms of what a really spiritually powerful movement could offer us in this moment. So I started to do the research, and that by the time it came to me doing my research, Zaytuna Institute had become a college. And so then the project became about this institution. And then when it came time to moving from what I did for school, my PhD dissertation, to the book, I knew I wanted to zoom out and tell a larger story. It wasn't just about Zaytuna College. It was about what came before and what will happen later. And I want to mention Sister Damira Ahmed. She is one of the people. The book is dedicated to all the seekers and Sister Damira, who passed away while I was writing the book. And she wasn't initially in the book, but she was a really important person for me who told me to think about what had been in the Bay Area in the Muslim community before Zaytuna was even an idea. And she had been a member of the Black Panther Party. She had been a part of the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State that established ethnic studies. She converted to Islam first through the Nation of Islam, and then was a part of the Warith Deen community, and then a number of other communities throughout the Bay Area. And she really modeled for me that there wasn't a contradiction between being politically engaged and caring about social justice and being Muslim. And I really wanted that spirit and her lessons to really ground the book in a lot of ways, to offer us some historical lessons so that we could think about the future in new ways and take those lessons with us. And I think as you all join me again, I really think it's meaningful that Jerell's words opened our conversation, because doing the work with Believers Bailout and thinking about Muslims who are incarcerated, Muslims who've been assassinated, who've been exiled, really also became the center of the book in terms of how we think from the position of those who most experience what structures of power do, right? And in some ways, they offer the greatest truth of the world that we live in.
I love that. That is beautiful, and I think it's going to touch on so many different topics as we continue on. I think related, I think this idea of community, which is such a pillar of this book and really feels like the foundation where all of the other branches grow, I think it makes sense to then turn to our community here, and so many of these people here on our virtual stage are an active part of community, that are a part of, your community and the Bay Area community in terms of how we're thinking about both the contents of the book and, the bigger picture in which it takes place. So I'd love to turn to the rest of our panel and ask a similar question of what specific maybe line or broader topic or theme resonated from the book. Bonus points if you can share a page number, but no pressure. If you've memorized the whole book and you know exactly where it is, that's fine. But what resonated with you in particular, and if you can share why, and if that speaks to either your work or your own respective relationship with your community. And I will invite Maryam to respond to each of your points at the end, but I guess I can call on someone. Kamilah, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me as part of this conversation. I was asking myself and then asking you, why am I here? Not because I don't have anything to add, but because, there are, Rasheed from the Bay, Hoda is living in the Bay Area. Folks are more closely connected to that area. and the stories from that area. But I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. I think what struck me in the very beginning was the framing of the book, but the framing of how you were thinking about engaging things. So what I have on my sticky note here, because I wrote it down, was the ethno-cinematic gestures, like those questions that you were asking in the very beginning that kind of show up in other places in the book, if not explicitly, but in how you were thinking about your engagement. Is what do you hear? What do you see? What is being refused and what is being offered? And I like that framing as someone who is engaged in community and concerned about community. And then also, Maryam, I don't know why I'm on the screen by myself, but Maryam and I have had talked before, a long time before, about really like what it means to build community on deeper levels, right? Like to be deeply engaged with the folks around you, what community means, how you build it, how you hold it together. In parts of the book, you talk about Imam Jamil al-Amin. That is the community that I was raised in the West End of Atlanta. And seeing that community suffer fracture after fracture, and people struggle to hold that together, right? And then thinking about every community that I've been a part of or made for myself since then, and always thinking like, how do we stay engaged with each other? How do we repair harm when it occurs, right? How do we make sure that the fractures, either from within or without, don't fracture us completely and permanently? Because, we all we got. And if we don't have each other, Allah has us, right, ultimately. But Allah gives us each other to take these journeys with. And so I liked that framing of like, when you're listening to people, what do you hear? Just in the mundane, right? The adhan or the rhythms of a community. What do you hear? What do you see when communities are presenting themselves or keeping part of themselves? And then that last one, like what is being refused and what is being offered, I think is key for folks being able to kind of dictate the public and the private, the sacred, and what's up for grabs. And, as a Muslim woman who wears hijab, that's something I'm always grappling with, even in community spaces, right? So I liked that framing.
And that is why you're here, Kamilah. Because you always help me see things. Even though I wrote the book, you also help me see things in another way as well, right? Like the way that you're thinking about these questions opens them up so beautifully in the way that it was intended, but I didn't know where people would take those questions, right? So thank you.
Thank you. Rasheed, would you like to go next?
Will I, or would I like to?
You're being voluntold.
Understood. This man.
Gently voluntold.
All good. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this contribution of this book. I think what stood out to me most was the spatial aspects of it. So thinking about the geography. So, the framing of Medina by the Bay can speak to both, this second hijra, of the community believers of the Ummah seeking a safe place to practice Islam. And I think it also speaks to, for among some geographers, there's the actual physical space, and then there's conceived space and these representations of space. And so I think that concept of the Bay being, or the Medina being by the Bay, it just resonated with some ideas that I was introduced to through hip hop. So when I did listen to, so I was born in Oakland, I'm from town, from the Bay, and in as I was growing up, I mainly listened to West Coast hip hop. But when I listen to East Coast hip hop, some folks influenced by 5% teachings would talk about a New Jerusalem, or what, I don't even remember all the stuff they was talking about. I wasn't Muslim at the time. I didn't know what they was talking about. But I think when I would hear like some of those concepts, and people are equating, places in New York to different boroughs, and that and on the East Coast, it's interesting to have that analogy here. And so again, just beyond just that is the metaphor for the book, like going beyond the title of it. One thing that was a constant presence was just the different scales, right? So in geography, we think of from the scale of the human body to, it could be a block, it could be a building, it could be the block, it could be a neighborhood, the city, the whole globe, the universe, right? All of Allah's creation. And so that was just really present in this. And then I'll just add one other piece. I was trying to find the page, because with being voluntold, I was also encouraged to, cite the page number. But really in the introduction,
I was giving you time to find the page by complimenting your studiousness.
Oh, that's smooth. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm on for citing our sources properly. And then I know around where it's at. But it's in towards the beginning, and you're pulling on the work of Clyde Woods, the late Clyde Woods, great Clyde Woods, who, push forward this concept of a blues ontology or blues epistemology, really blues geographies. And so, when you mention the blues of Thon in the text, I can hear the brother at Master War theme, giving this blues of Thon. And so I think connecting the sounds of the blues of Thon to the migration, and really something that's rooted, in our multiple forced migrations, and trying to establish ourselves, it really resonated. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rasheed. I think it was really important that the town was represented. I was born in the city in San Francisco. And this was something actually that was really important to me in terms of thinking about the book. And someone had later mentioned, was like, yeah, you're like, this is like the geographic turn in the anthropology of Islam, to put it like really academically, but like taking the geography really taking the geography really seriously, the locality, because people always will talk about Islam as this thing that kind of travels around as like a box, and it drops in a place and then it goes, like it opens, right? Whereas I felt like I had to talk about how Islam actually emerges from specificities of place, from the specific populations that are there, and all the histories that are present in the place, and what the histories that people bring with them, right, into Islam, right? And that impacts what Islam becomes, how it's practiced, how it's received, and then how it grows from that. And I thought, and I think there's a line in the book at some point where I talk about the Bay Area as being either a vanguard or an anomaly, right? So it's either kind of the start of something that spreads out into the rest of the country, like certain ideas and cultures and things like that, or is it like this exceptional place where things only happen in the Bay, right? I remember when I was doing the research, like there was a brother from like the Midwest, and then also folks on the East Coast, who would kind of talk about California Islam in a kind of derogatory way. And I was like, I don't, like, what does that even mean, right? They were probably just jealous, but, like, especially in the Bay Area, because we have such richness and diversity. And like being in Chicago now, I see something similar, but because the geography is so different, people interact really differently, right? Like the Bay Area is like a big space, but people move, or at least they used to before traffic got so bad. They used to move around quite a bit in the community. Like, you know, I'm going to go to the South Bay for Juma on Friday, but then go to this lecture in Oakland on Saturday, and then go to this talk in San Francisco on Sunday, right? And people met each other. And I think that was really important in terms of how people imagined what the Ummah was, right? I want to see if Shireen wants to add some words from Jerell.
Yeah, thank you. Jerell has highlighted a number of passages, but here are two that really resonated with him. In chapter 1, you mentioned the liquor/grocery store Muslims. This brought back so many memories. These Arabs were huge parts of my community. At times, we protected them, and at times, they alerted us. It was not a relationship of contention. But ironically, we never acknowledged each other as Muslims, not even a salam. I think circumstances had us in two different modes of survival, and there was abandonment of the Quran that caused harm done on both ends. Then, as well as today, many Muslim immigrants come to the West adhering to the judgments and prejudices of the dominant group, aka white people. Black Americans have been portrayed as the lowest of character to the masses. When another race, looking for upward mobility in the West, assimilates into the status quo, the last thing they want to do is be aligned with those they are programmed to think will hinder them in any way. Capitalism has a dual character, one that homogenizes and one that differentiates. They operate in conjunction with an exploitation axis and the expropriation axis, which relies on a logic of differentiation, which reproduces racialized and gendered subjects. And at the bottom of this axis for 500 years has been African Americans. This has had a psychological effect that informs how some Muslims who are Black see and feel about themselves, the world, and other non-Black Muslims. Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz seemed to be solidifying relationships between the Arab and African American communities before his death. The carceral state forcibly interrupted the harmony of these relations with his assassination. You speak to this in chapter 2, during Habib Omar's visit to Shabazz's grave. You endeavor to reclaim the spiritual Malcolm, the Allah-conscious Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, to situate his life's work and legacy towards ta'deeb within a genealogy that leads back to the prophets of Islam. Al-Hajj Malik has always been a martyr in the Black community, but I was elated to learn of his status and standing as a wali, a global Muslim figure, and I loved how eloquently you framed the prophet's descendant, Habib Omar's visitation to his gravesite as bringing Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz's figurative body in relation to the Prophet Muhammad's, may peace be upon him.
Thank you. Maryam, would you like to respond to this?
I mean, Jerell brings up so much there. I think thinking about Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz as a wali, right, as someone who has a standing with Allah. I don't know if like traditional Muslim scholars would grant him that. In some ways, I don't know if it matters, right? But I think in terms of how many people he brought to Islam and continues to bring to Islam, there is a really powerful spiritual force there. This episode that Jerell speaks about in chapter 2 is when Habib Umar bin Hafiz, a descendant of the Prophet, scholar in Hadramaut, Yemen, he comes and visits the different cities that his students came from around North America. And And so these are places like Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Toronto, San Diego, Los Angeles. And he wants to and this also helped me sort of think about the geographic specificity, because Habib Omar recognized the geographic specificity of who his students were, right? These were mostly like working class, Black and brown, mostly men of color, right? Who were traveling to Yemen to study Islam, some who were born into it, some who had reverted or converted to Islam. And he was like, what is it about where these brothers are coming from and sisters that is drawing them to Islam, right? And how should they go back to their homes and bring more people into Islam, right? And so I think there's something, and Jerell's also bringing up, of course, issues of race, which we talk a lot about. We talk a lot about in Believers Bailout, right? In terms of thinking about how members of our community are specifically targeted by the prison industrial complex, by policing, and how we also have a lot of intra-Muslim racism to deal with, right? One of the things I say in the book is that perhaps we didn't react very well to 9/11 because we weren't talking to each other, right? Like if the so-called immigrant Muslim communities had actually been listening to Black Muslim communities, they would have reacted differently to the FBI invitations and requests for information and letting them infiltrate our communities, right? We would know, like, what the intention is of the state vis-a-vis rebellion, vis-a-vis critique and resistance, right? There's a moment I talk about in the book where there was a meeting of Black imams in Atlanta, and out of the imams that were there, right, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who Kamilah is from, like, whose community Kamilah is from, has been incarcerated for a long time now, right? Imam Luqman was assassinated. Muhammad Sharif is exiled, right? Like these were people who were trying to not only heal Black Muslim communities and Black communities, but all our communities, right? And they offered a critique of the state, and they were attacked for that, right? And I think, especially in this moment right now, we are offering a critique of the state. And how is the state responding, right?
Beautiful. Kamilah, yes, please respond.
Yeah, I think what bothers me, not about the book, but it's something that Jerel mentioned in his letter, his note, his reflection. And you did talk about it a bit, right? Like, there's a moment where there's like this reclamation of Malcolm's Muslimness, right? And bringing him, from just being this very powerful Black political leader into this Muslimness, as if it wasn't something that he already owned, right, and had, but like this broader acceptance by non-Black Muslims of his Muslimness and the importance of it, and the importance of him being Muslim to his political thought, right, and the impact that he had in Black communities and in Black Muslim communities, right? And it almost feels like since then, like that duality can't exist. Like he can't be Black and Muslim, right? So that now there's like this separation from his Blackness almost, as if his very positionality was not informed by the fact that he was a Black man being raised by Black women, right, in Black community. And so what we get now is this kind of like weird separation, and this claiming of his thought, his legacy by non-Black Muslims in a way that once again positions Black Muslims kind of on the outside of this. And it's a very weird thing. Like, I don't know, it feels like it would feel like a weird thing for somebody to do, but I guess people are just weird in general. Because then that happens, right? And then we like circle back to these same kind of conversations where it feels like it's impossible for some people to recognize that being Black and Muslim in this country is an experience that should have political currency across racial, ethnic groups, right? Across faith traditions, like across every sort of identity. Because being Black and Muslim in this community, like, we're the reason that so many bad things exist in the carceral state. Like, it's not a great thing, but it's the truth, right? Mm-hmm. And how we have figured out how to navigate those systems, it can be instructive. And the fact that it's not, or that people want to separate pieces of it and take what they like and then leave the rest and then leave Black Muslim communities behind, is very telling.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown. You know, I've seen this, encountered this, and just thinking back to, you know, some of this reference in the text, but I think probably most, or I've seen it articulated by, was it Abdul Hakim, Sherman Jackson, about religious authority. And so I think part of it's like a way of claiming Malcolm without bestowing that religious authority that has been snatched. So there are some folks who can try to claim Malcolm to connect to a longer lineage of Muslims, but at the same time, this, what do you call it? Disembodying his Blackness as a way of not conferring religious authority to those who are Black and Muslim.
Absolutely. Like, you can't utter the name of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz without fighting for Black people. And I think a lot of the times, and like in Black liberation, very much as tied to all liberation, right? And I think and also just liberation generally and social justice generally. I think people will like to talk about Malcolm, invoke his legacy, and I'm not sure what legacy folks are talking about, right? Like, because up until the end, he was fighting for people. He martyred himself for his people, right? And I think he's such an example, right? I say that the book subsists with him, like it can't exist without his example, because, and he was a fallible person too, right? Like, and I think that's also really important for our community, right? To think about what it means to have a wali, to have an ancestor who made mistakes and admitted to his mistakes, right? Who wasn't afraid to change his mind, right? Like, what a humble leader he was, right? Jerell uses the word servant leader. He was like a true servant leader, right?
Absolutely. You know, I want to just bring something back to the text and not to take away from conversation of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Brother Omar Wali. I think one of the things that one of the reasons I enjoy studying history is the opportunity to learn lessons from the past that, you know, we can utilize today. And one of the things in this book you bring up relates to, you know, contradictions or challenges and contradictions. And so going back to geography for a moment and maybe genealogy, you know, thinking about some of the, you identify sort of like three streams of, you know, Islam in the Bay. And you don't use stream, but we're streaming. And I was reading Isabel Wilkerson again, so I'm using streams. But, you know, up from the South, and this is the Black American Muslim, the Bilalians. From the Pacific. So thinking of all these folks who migrated from Asia, and then sort of this beatnik hippie, I'm gonna embrace the East sort of tradition. That's how I'm reframing it. And maybe my white Muslim brothers and sisters don't like it, holla at me. See me in the hate Ashbury or something. But or Berkeley, that would be probably more appropriate. I think
though? They drive so slow. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I take transit. So I think that, you talk about, and part of this history is, Islam centered in the inner core, like these larger urban centers of the Bay Area, but then it's spreading out to the East Bay. And then with that, later groups being positioned differently, right? Like the Somali immigrants are not having the same experience as people with the, what do you call it, H-1 visa that are coming to work in Silicon Valley, right? And then you have, at the same time, Zaytuna shifts from being this institute to being a college and later accredited. You have, a masjid in East Oakland losing their building during the subprime, predatory foreclosure crisis. And so I think one of the lessons among many lessons is just like learning from like how do people in leadership, Muslims in leadership positions interface with each other? How do we deal with each other with when we position differently? And like how do we tell these stories truthfully so that we can continue to learn those lessons? The Don's calling, so I'm gonna go on mute and probably answer that call, inshallah.
Thanks, Rasheed. I'm going to respond a little bit to what you're saying because I think it's super important, and I just want to like yell this from the mountaintops. Is that there was a recent, I think, Pew study that the number of mosques is growing in the United States. The number of Muslims is growing. The number of Black majority mosques is shrinking. This is an emergency for our community, right? There is so, and I think this is part of what the book is trying to do. There are so many like fountains of wealth, of history, of lessons, of like what this place is in each of these communities, right? Islam, people turn to Islam, for its spiritual truth and for survival. Is like, that's the subtitle of the book, right? People studied Islam, became Muslim for surviving, right? In the belly of the beast, right? The center of this, to use a fancy word, colonial, racial, capitalist place, right? And so there's lessons on how to understand colonialism, how to understand racism, how to understand capitalism. People thought that there were answers in Islam, right? And then meanwhile, a lot of the communities trying to understand how to do Islamic finances in a way that, seems halal, but has no critique of capitalism, really, right? That it takes capitalism for granted. Whereas, we had merchants, we had trading. That was not capitalism in terms of its extractive, death-desiring system that it is. And so I do think we're in like a moment of great flourishing, but we're also in a moment where we really have to pay attention to like what's happening to the broader community. Imam Zaid, I think it was like in 1996 or something, he had a CD set where he talks about, to throwback, there was a box set where he talked about like there was a window, right, where people, where the Black community would be like brought into Islam, or brought back to Islam. And he was talking even then around like the window was closing. I think the window is still open, but I think it's more important to keep the people who are already here in Islam, right, and with us, and the institutions they have built, right? I think there are a lot of ways to think about our future, and I'm just concerned if the future takes what we've entered into for granted as if it's the only system that we can live in, whereas our faith Our revelation tells us there's a different system. There are different priorities, right?
So I think like,
oh, I'm sorry, Kamilah, if I could just a quick comment. That study was from the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, Dr. Isam Bakbi, the 2020 Moss survey. And inshallah, I have a report that'll hopefully come out by the end of this year, responding to those findings, looking at Atlanta and Los Angeles.
Excellent.
I was gonna say that, like, you said that it's an emergency, that the number of Black Muslim majority or Muslim-led mosques are shrinking, and it is, but it's only an emergency if you value, like, inherently the contributions and lessons and just like humanness of Black Muslims, because if you don't, then it's not right. And if you don't, then that's how you get, frankly, so many masjids. Because if we're just keeping it a buck, people like to believe that they immigrated and they were the first people to like establish masjid.
That first masjid, tell them about
it. First masjid, right? They will put a plaque somewhere and be like, first masjid in this place. And it's like, actually, no. You're probably like the third. Because one thing Black Muslims are going to do, we're going to have a musalla somewhere. It's going to be an apartment. It's going to be a storefront. It's going to be somewhere. And we're going to have been there for a very long time. And what happens, I can't speak specifically about the Bay beyond the book, but I can speak about Atlanta and the parallels, right? And in Atlanta, in that period that you were talking about, the 80s, the 70s, I was not, but 70s and 80s, 90s, there were just two. There were two masjids, right? There was one, there was Atlanta Masjid, right? And then there was what became 14th Street Masjid. And that wasn't actually a masjid. It was more of a musalla, and it was more of a place where students who lived at Georgia Tech were going to pray. It wasn't a community, right? It wasn't a community for a very long time. And so people were making decisions about where they wanted to be spatially, but then also like where they wanted to be spiritually. And it wasn't with Black Muslims. And so, like you talk about, that money moved out, people moved out, they took resources other places. And there's a line in the book that you said, the Black Muslim community goes the way of the Black community, right? So our Islam, our Muslimness doesn't separate us from all of the things that happen to other Black folks. And that includes the impacts of capitalism, right? That includes where we live, how we live, and sometimes how we worship or where we worship. And I know of so many Black Muslim communities who are struggling to keep schools open while other communities open like big brand new buildings and then say, this is the first school in this area, right? Or they offer classes. I'm like, this is the first time that anybody's ever done this thing. Or, they open a store. This is the first store ever, Muslim-owned store here. This is the first this. It's always the first. It's 2024. There's no more first, right? Like, it's impossible for you to say you're the first Muslim to do pretty much anything at this point. But it's that like that thing of, if you don't inherently value Black folk, and you're not going to like extend that to Black Muslims. And if you don't have that, we can't really have community here, because it doesn't matter what our percentages look like. We're like the base here, right? And that's what you were talking about, that history, that kind of knowledge, that grounding, that situates you politically and socially. Because for me, there was never a moment where I had to grapple with being Muslim and my like political grounding or how I viewed society. That has always been Islam to me. That's always been Islam to me, right? That's how I was raised as Muslim. And so, I don't know, I think that that's a part that's kind of missing in people's telling of stories, or even like their examination of history or their examination of this moment and how we get here, which leaves us lacking something when we think about how we move forward from here. Because it's not just about, well, if folks had listened to Black Muslims after September 11th, we would have been positioned differently. If folks were living with Black Muslims during that time, right, things would have looked different. If folks were just like spatially closer, things would have looked different. Not just like listening, just like literally just being spatially closer, things would have been different. And that's not a 20-some years ago lesson. That's a now lesson, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. This has been really rich. I forgot I was moderating. Thanks for ripping off of each other. I want to just jump in with 2 quick points, and then we can maybe have 1 or 2 other questions. First is that for those of you watching, if you have any questions, follow-up questions, comments, reflections, thoughts, feelings, please share that in the chat. We can either ask them as we go or save that for the end. And I'm sure Maryam would appreciate all reflections to her book. So please do engage. We're seeing the chat, so we can also engage with you. Second, if anybody also has any specific reflections or reactions or want to engage further with Jerel Matthews, feel free to also reach out to Believers Bailout with those reflections, comments, and interest in engaging with him, and we can also facilitate that as well too. So wanted to send those out before we wrap up. And there was so much richness. I tried to take some notes, but again, kind of situating from this idea of, what forms a community, who is not community, and thinking about, as Rasheed mentioned, geographies and space, as Kamilah mentioned, public, private, also like class, race, that came up in so many of these. There's so much like depth to the ways that we can have conversations, and kind of like go in these different directions. I also want to kind of zoom in a little bit. I know we're talking very high level. And so thinking about how all of these aspects and factors of like what makes a community, what creates borders around communities, what contours a neighborhood versus a community. How does that lead to questions about accountability? How does that lead to, what are our institutions' roles in creating accountability? And how does that misalignment possibly create a co-optation, which I think also is a theme that we saw in the book as well too. And I think is particularly relevant in, the genocide that's going on right now too. Another community is the US empire. And so as we're, kind of filling in and drawing these sometimes arbitrary, sometimes not, sometimes very intentional lines around who belongs and what parts of your identity belong. What are maybe specific examples, either from the book or from your own lived experience in the city that you live in, of what has been like a beautiful practice of community that you've seen that has really felt like this is what has made this feel right and home for me? Obviously, it's hard. There's 100 things that make any community. But if we can point to one thing just to kind of bring us down and put our foot onto something, or maybe something that has been a challenge. I think Kamilah kind of started us off as like, there's no proximity to the people who we are trying to learn from. We as non-Black Muslims, we as classed individuals, educated people working, the communities are very, very segregated, intentionally so. So that, for example, is one big way in which that kind of silos our ability to actually build and learn together and see ourselves as one. So either or both. A beautiful aspect that feels resonating, or a challenge that we see that speaks to our moment today. Shireen, would you like to go first to see if, I think there are some things in Jerel Matthews' piece that gives everybody else time to think.
Okay. There's so much to share. He wrote such a rich response to this book. I think I will share a couple of things. So this is something Jerell shared about his own experience. When Muslim leadership and middle-class Muslims distance or differentiate themselves from what is considered by hegemonic forces as their lower-class brethren, they feed into the West's notion of exceptionalism. This is used to dismantle anti-racist struggles and foreclose forms of resistance, like armed struggle and guerrilla warfare by insurgents, which is outside the limits of white supremacist law. Imperialists of the US and those they are aligned with use certain types of Muslims to pathologize resistance and make their crimes against us invisible. Stokely Carmichael put it best when he said, quote, "The way the oppressor tries to stop the oppressed from using violence as a means to attain liberation is to raise ethical or moral questions about violence. Right now, here in prison, after a long fight to receive halal diets, which was won, Muslims are basically being starved by being served a small portion of beans and 2 small pancakes or waffles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with no meat. This is outright inhumane, while those who receive kosher meals, such as Jewish people, are provided a full meal with the proper amount of calories and different meats from the vendor who provides their meals. What Muslim vendor would send their brothers and sisters in bondage what we are receiving? This is indeed an act of repression and discrimination, and has caused many of the brothers to get off of halal diets in order to receive the proper nourishment their bodies need." I know that's a lot already, but I just want to add some really beautiful comments that Jerell wrote about gender and learning from Muslim sisters as well as non-Muslim sisters. So this is about Maryam's context of intimate distance. In chapter 4, you describe the intimate distance as a sense and desire for the closeness and proximity typically felt across distances of gender, geography, and time that encompasses a constantly shifting myriad of feelings. I love the phrase intimate distance. It can be used in many different contexts. This section answered questions that I've always wanted to ask some of the sisters, and it also made me think critically about the progression of Islam. I understood exactly what Zahra was feeling when she stated that she would like to hug Imam Zayd, who was a father figure to her, but she couldn't. Just as I sympathized with the sisters who were trying to figure out what special way they could properly greet the Prophet's descendants. I have love and admiration for my sisters, whom I learn from and whom I'd like to hug, but I can't. Our relationship was cultivated from a physical distance dictated not only by Muslim cultural notions of gendered formality, but also the dehumanizing regulations of this carceral environment in which I'm restrained. Rules I have had to break to console my crying teenage daughter during visitation. When I used to enter Jama'at Ibadur Rahman, I was always greeted by my most loyal and trusted brothers with smiles, handshakes, and hugs. But I cannot greet my sisters with any signs of affection. It's always awkward greeting and departing from the sisters. Once, one of my sisters told me she could not wait to pray with me and the Jama'at, but I thought to myself, are we really praying together with you, enclosed between chairs alone, and I shoulder to shoulder with the brothers? It's because when we would go in for Jama'ah, the brothers would set up these plastic chairs around the area for sisters to pray. I think it was an act of care. Muslim women today remain susceptible to patriarchal purview, while a majority of Muslim men, as Abdul Khabir states, are incapacitated by patriarchal regimes that establish a singular frame through which they are allowed to imagine and interact with women, children, other men, and themselves. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Rasheed, would you like to go next? I'm mixing it up.
Sure, I will. You know, I hearing the brother's comment about wanting to hug his sister. I actually said that to a sister this weekend. So I went to a banquet CARE held in the South Bay. So back to the geography, we had to go down 880 to Silicon Valley because that's where you can raise $1 million. So I saw this elder sister at the table, and I hadn't seen her. I maybe seen her like twice since the pandemic, like, Zoom, Jumas, and, the masjid in the city of Alameda is currently under construction. And so, folks are going different places. So I haven't seen her in like 5 years. Actually, no, I saw her once at Juma, but I just was so excited to see her. I was like, oh, Sister Ruby, I want to give you a hug. But I can't. Because Sister Ruby don't play, not even just on any other stuff. You just can't walk up to Sister Ruby and hug her. But I appreciate that point about that connection. So I think, some of the gender boundaries that we have as far as being that impacts how we're in community. I ain't talking about physical touch, proximity, sisters' access to scholars, and how some spaces, the side entrances that restrict sisters' mobility to be able to learn. I think the issue of class definitely influences how we are all able to connect. So, I really can't add too much beyond what the brothers shared, but I would add just some of the instances of community I've seen that have been really beautiful. So it's the folks who have worked to prepare meals to take inside to folks up in whether it's Vacaville or elsewhere to have Eids, all of the challenges folks go through just to be able to go inside to connect with our folks who are held in captivity inside. I just appreciate all that folks do, and then that food being like distributed in the community. So all the effort folks do to feed folks like within the community, the Ummah, so other Muslims, like we used to host a monthly iftar at Lighthouse Mosque, and so many people would prepare food. That was much better than the stuff I would buy. Or like people who are actually feeding our unhoused neighbors that are, it's too many folks that are unhoused in Oakland, California. And so, I just think there are those acts of community that, exemplify what I think is critical in our tradition.
Thank you. That reminded me of a quote from Kamilah Pickett in this book that I will read and then pass on to Kamilah. This is on page 169 for those of you following along. As Maryam writes, many Muslim women scholars do not aspire to celebrity scholar status and are reluctant to be public figures. In other cases, they express a wariness about Muslim institutions that hire women for visibility and representation, but not for experiential and scholarly knowledge. As Black Muslim abolitionist Kamilah Pickett says, quote, it's always listen to and follow Black women until a Black woman actually says something that challenges you. Story of my life. Pickett, 2021. Kamilah,
Pickett, 2024. Right. I think to Rasheed's point, like it's not just that spatial thing, right? But it's also like just the burden we place on women in our community to keep things going, to be like the moral center of spaces, right? To be the engine that runs and kind of perpetuates our communities, right? Without any of that recognition, and most sisters are not asking for that, right? But there is not even that general recognition that it's being done, that it's happening. You don't ever have to look far to see Muslim women running something. Not for any like glory, but like out of necessity. Because because if we don't do it, we suffer the ill impacts, right? Not just it won't get done, but then we are the first to kind of suffer the impacts of the absence of that type of care, right? And so we shoulder a lot of that, and that is a lot of weight to place on folks doing that. And so I'm always encouraged by the folks that raised me, right? I get super happy when I see, especially older Muslim women that I grew up with in spaces like relaxing. That makes me happy, right? Or that they're still there. Because honestly, a lot of folks that I grew up with are not still here. Or if they are here, they are not whole in the way that they would like to be. And so seeing older Muslim women in my community chilling in spaces, right? And not having to be the folks that are cooking the food and watching the kids and doing this and doing that, just being in the masjid, talking, right? There is nothing, and I tell my best friends this all the time. If you want to boost for like your soul, there's nothing like going and hanging out after Jummah in Black Muslim communities. Like, that does it for me, right? Even if I miss Jummah because I can't go to work, sometimes I will just go and just hang out after Jummah and sit there, because there's nothing like it. That kind of love and that familiarity, right? And that feeling of like, this is a place that I know, these are people I know. And if a older Black Muslim woman tells you look cute, you cute, you're good, right? Like, what else do you need? If somebody comes up and gives you a hug or tells you they're proud of you, or they saw something that you did and to keep doing it, and it's encouragement, like that to me feels like community, right? Community that, not community that I'm building, but community that built me. And so that feels good. And that feels like I'm doing something right. Right? If you have older folks who've known you through all of your growing, and they can like see you and recognize you for what you're trying to do, right? That feels good. That feels like a good thing. There's a quote in the back of the book by Suhaima Manzoor Khan. It says, love us when we are lazy, love us when we are poor, love us high as kites, unemployed, joyriding, time wasting, failing at school, love us filthy, love us silent, unapologizing, sometimes violent. When we are wretched, suicidal, naked, and contributing nothing, love us then. And I feel like that's community, right? That's people who love you through all of that, who see you through all of that. And if you have that inherently in you, and then that drives me to try to build that other places for myself, to build that for myself, to build that for my nieces and my nephew, to be, inshallah, that type of person that like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, some young person can see me somewhere chilling, and I could be like, girl, you look good. And I'd be like, oh, Sister Kamilah told me I look cute. I'm good, right? Like, that's the goal.
Good thing you always look cute. MashaAllah. Maryam, would you like to close out this question?
Yeah, I think a number of things came up for me in what y'all were saying. One of the concerns I generally have, and then I express in the book, is the state of our hearts, right? And what happens to our hearts when we put boundaries around them, make in terms of like judging people and deeming some less than and less worthy of our love, our care, our concern, our attention, right? This current moment is a moment that really challenges us to keep our hearts open and soft because it is a very painful time. And so we need those moments that Kamilah is describing, as Rasheed put in the notes, right? The bean pie and bonding, right? Those moments really matter. Like, how many people know who cleans the bathrooms at their masjid? That's love. That's care, right? Who's assembling these meals, right? Who makes sure the doors are open, right? So that people can actually go into the masjid, right? That's probably one of the biggest losses post 9/11 was that masjids weren't just open all the time, right? A brother told me how like you used to be able to just like roll up to the masjid, and if you were staying, we had a place to stay there, right? And how people became so suspicious in the later years, right? And so when we approach each other with suspicion, that's a really different orientation, and that's not sunnah, right? Like the sunnah is that we spend time with each other, especially after Jummah prayer, right? That is the right that our community has on us, right? And I think this is also one of those things post-COVID, and this is also a challenge, I think, for folks of my generation who are increasingly becoming the elders in the community, is how are we going to do what our elders did to hold us together, right? Like I went to a wedding that had 900 people at it. And the thing that amazed us was how many generations of a family were there, right? That they were able to maintain family and community under the conditions of the United States, right? That is like a win. That is hard to do here, right? To have multiple generations of the family there, like present, reciting poetry, right? Like speaking multiple languages, doing all the things, and all being Muslim, like real, like believers. And so I think that's a challenge for us in terms of what kind of community building we're going to do. So like not only institutions, but as we've been talking about, the spaces are really, really important, right? We have to hold on to the spaces, right? But then what are we doing in those spaces, and how do people feel when they're in those spaces, right? Do they feel good? Do they want to come back? Or does it feel like a chore, right? And they want to run out of there as soon as possible, right? How do we make these things beautiful? And I guess on that note, I think the intergenerational work is really important. That our young people spend more time with our elders, right? And that stories and experiences get exchanged. And it's not always unidirectional, right? It's not always that the elders have to teach the youth, right? I think the youth have a lot to offer the elders, right? I actually, like if I had a 10-point plan for the Muslim community, is that young people should have representation on mosque boards, right? Like they should be just as a part of governing the community as the elders with the most money and time, right? I think we have to resituate and rethink like the governance of our communities as well, and the governance of the institutions. And I think Hoda kept trying to get us to talk about it, but this question of accountability, right? And how do we bring these abolitionist ideas, these ideas around transformative justice into our Muslim spaces is also really important, right? That was probably one of the most important things I gained, to go back to your like very first question, in the process of writing this book, at the same time that I was doing Believers Bailout, was to like take seriously what it meant to be like a Muslim abolitionist, right? Like when harm happens in our community, what is the abolitionist response? What is the Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim response, right? And so I think, and when I see that, those are the beautiful moments of community. And I've experienced it with you sisters here, right? Like that, to have that experience of community building has been really important.
Amen. We'll all hang out with you, Maryam, so we learn from our elders.
You know, I'm always learning.
That was supposed to be mean. You weren't supposed to take that seriously. So, I know you have a thought. Before we get there, I also want to read off a chat from M. Sharif, who I think this is an example of a fault of our community, which is the stinginess of salams. We are lucky if we get a full assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which I think actually is very indicative and like, you know, speaks to a lot of what everybody has said about just like the closeness and presentness of just sitting with each other and giving time to each other. But Kamilah, I know you mentioned you have another thought.
I did, and it's kind of connected to all of this pulling together. But Maryam mentioned, you know, like our hearts, and I don't know, it just feels really important to recognize how fragile hearts of folks with compassion feel at the moment, right? And how much our hearts are carrying, and how that manifests in how we interact with each other, right? Whether we do so from places of like tenderness and empathy and compassion, or whether it's from a place of hurt and harm and pain. And in moments like these, all of those reactions feel justified and right. But in terms of like thinking about like that transformative justice and accountability and how we build that in, you can't have any of that if your hearts are not connected to other folks' hearts, right? Like there's no accountability if I just fundamentally don't care what you think about what I'm doing. And there's no accountability if we're not in some sort of relation to each other. I can't demand that you are accountable for something you've done if we're not in it together, right? If I can leave, leaving is a choice, or if you can banish me, right? Or if you can decide that you no longer want me as part of your community, and you can put me in a cage somewhere, or you know, or you can totally discount my humanity in any sort of way, or you can drop a bomb on me, then our hearts are not connected in any sort of meaningful way, and there's no space for that kind of transformative justice. And so for me, especially now, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the state of my own heart. I feel like sometimes we get like too concerned about other people's hearts. I'm really like concerned about the state of my own heart and how I keep my heart malleable, and I don't become one of those people that Allah talks about in the Quran that like have those hardened hearts that don't see and don't hear, right? And that ultimately are removed from guidance and removed from a path of ultimate like reward, right? And I don't know, I've just been making a lot of dua about that because I think that's really important, and that the way that we experience things, even if we're not experiencing them physically and we're just watching them happen, like there's that window of opportunity. There's that window that calls us to like not our best selves. And it's really hard to avoid in moments like these. But I feel better in the community that I've made for myself when I can talk to the people who love me about my heart. And when I feel like that sort of connection and people are concerned about my heart, like I'm and not in a like moralizing way, but like, are you good kind of way. And I don't think that we ask that of people enough, like, you good? And if you're not, like, how can I help you? And that feels like the basis, like very ground level basis for authentic like community, and accountability and all the things that come from that. It's just like your heart's got to be connected. If they're not, all that other stuff kind of falls to the waste.
And power and strength, and that's the only way we'll actually be able to move forward for any of everything that we've talked about today, and grow toward a more not resilient but powerful community is through those deep relationships that I feel like, especially in the United States, the Muslim community suffers with this type of strong community building. But thank you all so much. I know we've come up at an hour and a half. My room is getting dark. So everybody else has better interior lighting than I do. But thank you all so much. This has been such a rich conversation, and I know there are 50 more hours that we could have packed just on one topic. So I really hope that everybody watching please follows both Believers Bailout's work on social media and on our website, but also the work of every individual person here that makes up our community and defines who we are and hold us accountable. And we'll be sharing snippets of this discussion on social media along with a petition, the Statesville Muslim petition, to be able to support Jerel Matthews. We'll also be sharing more excerpts from Maryam's book, along with a link to purchase it with a discount code, so you too can dive into the richness that is this book. And please always keep in touch. And thank you for everybody who's left sweet words in the comments, and for staying with us through this hour and a half, and through this moment in our history and time today, which is very heavy. So thank you everybody who's on stage, but also thank you Nabiha, who's been backstage with all of the camera work, virtual camera work. Both Shireen Hamza for speaking on behalf of Jerell Williams, but also Shireen Yusuf, who has also been behind the scenes working, Aisha, our whole BBO team, that, as Kamilah mentioned and Rasheed mentioned, are always behind the scenes doing the important work, and our Muslim women. So thank you so much for all of our community, both present on stage with us and offline. And hopefully we will be able to all continue to build together toward a free Muslim ummah, both in this wretched country and globally.
Me. Can we plug our event next week too?
Yes, would you like to plug that?
Yeah, so we are doing an event on the 22nd with Orasami Burton and Wala Kiase on prison rebellion and resistance. They're both brilliant scholar activists. And Shireen and I will both be there in conversation with them. It will be one not to miss. Please do sign the petition that we're sharing around Jerel Matthews community. And we'll post more information about that as well. So thank you. Thank you all so much for engaging with the book.
Thank you. The last
Appreciate it.
very final piece is that Jerel Matthews has actually also written a beautiful conclusion. So Shireen will please read that, and then we'll all sign off.
Alhamdulillah for Sister Maryam. You are indeed a believer of Al-Wahhab, gifting us all with this publication. Medina by the Bay is a jewel that gives intimate examples of what a Muslim community should, could, and should not be, while also reminding us that we exist in a world shaped by hundreds of years of collective structural harms, with legacies of brutal colonization, slavery, and patriarchy that shape the cultures we create, making multiple forms of subordination very present in our relationships. The text counters this by designing spaces in the mind for intense dreaming found in Islamic radical relational imaginings, the politics of collectivism, mutual respect, and accountability. You take one's imagining beyond rational Western ways of knowing that draw from sources we feel, desire, honor, and empathize with, allowing room for creative growth and creative destruction. SubhanAllah.
Thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you at our next BBO event very soon, and please stay engaged, online, offline. Shab khair, good night, and that's a wrap.